We're in.
That was my Sioux helper.
Good morning, everybody. We're just letting folks in the doors and we'll get started shortly. Thanks for joining us, folks. We're just going to wait for another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we're good to go. So good morning, everyone. And my name is Chris Kilford. I'm the president of CIC Victoria, the Canadian International Council branch here in Victoria. And I'm also a former military officer who happened to also serve at our embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan from 2009 to 2010. So any time I have a chance to talk to Corey about Afghanistan, I always take it. So I'd like to welcome our CIC members and guests, and of course our guest speaker. And we're very glad that you were able to join us this morning. Before we do start, it's important to recognize that CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on Coast Salish territory and the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And for those of you that aren't familiar with CIC, we are an independent organization made up of some 1,300 members in 19 branches across the country who have a love and a focus on foreign policy and Canadian foreign policy in particular. And if you want to know more about the CIC, you can easily Google us, the Canadian International Council, and CIC Victoria itself. We have a Facebook page, which you can find pretty quickly if you just Google us. And here in Victoria, we have about, well, I think today about 480 members, which is terrific, and about 100 of them are students. So for our event today, I'll have a little bit of an intro about Afghanistan. I will introduce our speaker, of course, and later on we'll have a Q&A session. And I think most people are familiar with Zoom Q&As now. You can just scroll down to the bottom of the screen and you'll find a Q&A area, and you can type in there and I'll try to get to as many of your questions as I can. So let's get started. And before Corey takes the floor, and I have lots of questions for her, of course, I don't want to go too far back in history, but I think it's really good if we take a moment as a reminder about what has happened and what is happening in Afghanistan, because other events such as Ukraine, they sometimes take our focus away from Afghanistan and the Afghan people. So first of all, 1926 is when Afghanistan emerged as an independent country. And it had a monarchy at the time. It lasted for almost 50 years until a revolution in 1973, after which the Republic of Afghanistan was established. Now, I think most people are aware that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979 to prop up the communist-led government. And they remained there until 1989. And after they left, the Afghan government eventually collapsed, and it paved the way for the Taliban to take power in 1996. And they established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. But it only lasted till 2001, when after 9/11, the United States and its allies supporting the Northern Alliance invaded Afghanistan. But some 20 years later, the Taliban are now back in charge, returning to power in August of 2021 after a 20-year-long war with the United States and its allies, including Canada. Now, if you have been following the news, and I'm sure many of you have, the Afghan economy is in terrible shape. People are in desperate need of assistance, and many have fled. In addition, we know that women and girls have largely been erased from public life. Now, as for Canada, we lost 158 soldiers during our time there. More than 1,000, well, roughly 1,800 were wounded, and there were 7 Canadian civilians who were also killed. And our government is quite firm that it won't assist the Afghan government in any way. They're listed as the Taliban are listed as a terrorist organization. However, we have made a commitment to bring 40,000 refugees and vulnerable Afghans to Canada. But as I'm sure Corey will tell us, we have probably fallen quite short in achieving this number so far. So there's a little bit about Afghanistan, a bit of background, and now to our speaker, Corey Levine. And I'm always delighted to have when I have opportunities to speak with Corey. Corey is a human rights and peace building policy and programming expert, researcher and writer with a specialization in gender. And she has spent more than 20 years working in conflict areas such as Afghanistan, Bosnia, East Timor, Iraq, Kosovo, Mali, Palestine, Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, and Ukraine. Quite the list. And she was in Kabul up until the summer of 2021, where she spent 8 months working with UN Women, and she left just before the Taliban took over. Now, right now, Corey has been assisting in the resettlement of Afghan refugees in Canada, and she is closely associated with Aman Lara, an NGO dedicated to safeguarding and advocating for and evacuating Afghans at risk in Afghanistan. And she also traveled to Afghanistan during the summer, spending a week in Kabul, obviously with the Taliban there in charge. And so that's what we'll be talking about today, and many other things. And so, Corey, welcome to another CIC Victoria talk about Afghanistan. I'm glad you could be here this morning. Yeah. Oh, and Corey, you're muted. We have to get used to this whole Zoom business after the summer.
Yes, I should know by now, but thank you so much, Chris. Always a delight to have the opportunity to chat with you in whatever way, whether in person or over Zoom. And happy to be here with CIC and all the people that have showed up today. So grateful to be here and look forward to our chat.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. And before we actually pressed start on this webinar, I was telling Corey that this morning I notionally, not really, but I booked some flights to Kabul so that we could go back for a trip in the fall, and I can get us from Victoria to Seattle to Doha to Kabul round trip for $3,000 US. And so it tells you that life goes on in Afghanistan, even though we sometimes think it isn't. And I have to say, you're a person that I know has seen a lot of change in Afghanistan over the 2 decades that you've been in and out of that country. And I wanted to start us off this morning by taking us back to that first time you went to Afghanistan. And then just if you could tell us what you did see develop over those 2 decades, and then we'll focus more on your most recent trip. So what was it like in those early days?
Well, the first time I arrived in Afghanistan was about 6 months after the Taliban had fallen the first time around, 6 months after 9/11. It was in March of 2002, and I had gone to Afghanistan actually at the behest of the Canadian International Development Agency. Canada was just beginning to ramp up its activities in Afghanistan. And at that time, I was a consultant with the peace building unit, and they suggested that I go and see how we could spend, at that time, what seemed a huge amount of money, $250 million, doing peace building activities in Afghanistan. But when you look at it in the context of what Canada spent over 20 years, it was a mere drop in the bucket. At that time, there was no Canadian embassy or no Canadian presence, official Canadian presence on the ground. I see one of the participants is a former Canadian diplomat who was responsible for actually setting up the Canadian embassy, but that was a couple of years later. And then it was this incredible sense of optimism, and a sense that after 30 years of war, that the page had been finally turned, and that Afghanistan was entering a new era where the possibilities were endless. There were no security risks whatsoever at the time. I traveled the breadth and the width of the country. And the biggest thing at that time that was of concern was carjackings. So I wore a burqa just to hide the fact that I was a Westerner and therefore less likely to be carjacked. But that was it. People were incredibly friendly and welcoming, and everywhere we went, we were invited into people's homes. This would be a common occurrence. I would be walking down the street with my translator. Someone would come up to him and start talking to him, and they'd have this brief chat. And then he'd turn to me and he'd go, "Well, would you like to go to these people's home for lunch? They're inviting us over." And so I'd say, okay, we've got a bit of time before our next meeting, and off we go. And we get settled in, and often the homes where multi generations lived. And I'd say, "Please introduce me to your friends." And he'd go, "I don't know these people. They they saw that you were a foreigner and they came up to me and asked me if you would like to come over for lunch." And this was the kind of hospitality that I experienced all over the country, wherever we went. Fast forward 20 years later, I'm back in Kabul. I'm working for the UN. I live and work behind compound walls that are, barbed wired, armed, guarded 24/7. I can rarely leave the compound. When I do, it's in an armored vehicle. I'm not allowed to go anywhere, see anyone, stop at all. I can't even stop at a drugstore to get some medicine. And this is life 20 years on after the wonderful, ebullient experience of Afghanistan shortly after 9/11, where this, to quote Martin Luther King, we have a dream, and then to see basically that the dream has pretty much died. The security situation is such as why we're locked up in guarded compounds, and there are IEDs going off on the road all the time. I was there at the height of COVID. People used to joke, "Well, why would we be worried about COVID when we're worried about getting home?" At the end of the day. So it was such a stark vision or visual between the first time and then almost the last time that I was in Afghanistan. So
Yeah.
let's see.
Can I ask you though, was there a point, if you look incrementally over your time there, was there a particular point, say midway, where you said things have changed, or did it? Wasn't there? Or maybe there wasn't a defining moment in that 20-year period.
I think around 2005, 2006, you started to see the turn where security began to trump everything. And it no longer became so much about how can we support Afghans as how do we protect ourselves. And from then on, you could just really see that being ramped up, where security trumped everything. The security of international personnel like myself, whether you were working for the UN, for an embassy, or even for an NGO. It became and so it was a boon to security consultants, to ex-military people
Mm.
who had, then had great jobs of trying to figure out how to keep people safe.
Yeah, there was a tremendous military buildup. We saw, a surge in the level of U.S. troops in particular over that period of time, and then, of course, more responsibility given to the Afghan National Army, the Afghan National Police, to take on the brunt of the fighting, which they did. They did actually very, very well, very successfully. But not without, of course, the ongoing support of the United States. And in many respects, I said to you in the warm-up to this event that I'd felt the government in Kabul had been thrown under the bus by the United States because of the Doha Agreement. And it was a bit of a catastrophe. And we saw that at the airport last August. Terrible, terrible situation. And one wondered what might happen next. And this brings me to this trip that you took to Kabul this past summer. And when we had a chance to speak once before, I asked you, I had so many questions for you, what it was like to travel back to Afghanistan. And I just wanted to start touching on that and ask, what was it that brought you back to Pakistan and Afghanistan in the summer of this year?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I just want to go back to what you touched upon, because I think this is really, before I answer your question, I think it's really key to understanding what happened to Afghanistan. And it's not talked about that much, about the peace agreement that the US negotiated with the Taliban in Qatar, in Doha, Qatar, that left out the Afghans completely. The US government bypassed the legitimate Afghan government to negotiate their own peace with the Taliban. And that, I think, more than anything else, set the road for what we saw happened last August. And I truly feel like this is something that gets ignored. And I think if that peace agreement hadn't happened, Afghanistan would have hobbled along for some time more, but it was what precipitated the events of last August. So what I found when I returned was a city remarkably similar to what I had seen a year earlier, except that it was quieter. There was not the traffic and the noise and the congestion that I used to experience. I saw more people begging on the street than I had in many years. I saw that restaurants were open, businesses were open. I saw people being ingenious at the ways that they were trying to earn a living in the way that I did in the first few years that I traveled to Afghanistan. People would just try and figure out what kind of skills that they could sell in the street, whether it was engraving something or writing a letter for those who were not literate, or just selling, a lot of people selling things, household items, in order to try and put food on the table for their family. But the most, and there were still the same police checkpoints, except that now they were there with Taliban. Some Taliban were dressed as we traditionally see them in the news, with the turbans and the big black turbans and the beards and the traditional dress. Other Taliban looked like they had just stepped out of a recruitment poster for the US military and all this latest glossy military hardware that they had gotten when the country fell. But for me as a woman, the single biggest difference was the lack of female presence on the streets. And it was striking and it was startling.
When you you landed at the airport, Kabul airport, it's up and running, of course. And how easy was it for you to get into the country? You had to get a visa, I presume. And how did you go about doing that?
So, so you can fly to Afghanistan in the route that you mentioned, but the one thing is that you will need a visa to get into the country. And so far, as I'm aware, that the Afghan consulate in Dubai or in Pakistan are the ones to be issuing visas to the country. It's very easy to get a visa. You put your application in the morning with $750 and you get it back in the afternoon or early the next day. And then when I arrived at the airport, I was actually surprised to see, given the fact that the Taliban have more or less banned women from working, but there are still female customs agents. That's for women. So you're slotted to female customs agents. I was asked no questions and let into the country very easily. However, I was aware that the Taliban certainly knew who I was, and we were very careful about making sure that wherever we went, it was okay for Afghans, and we really restricted our movements and kept very closely just to the core of the city, because we knew that we were being monitored by the Taliban. Of course we would be.
But you were working with them and Lara, you still are, about, helping Afghans to come out of the country and come to Canada. But I think in this particular case, you weren't with and Lara, you were helping another group. Can you sort of say, what you were doing there, and was it worthwhile in the end? Do you think it's that reconnaissance mission has paid off now?
Yes, I do think it was worthwhile. I think it's always worthwhile when people are able to see for themselves what is the reality on the ground, and to hear from people themselves inside the country how they are experiencing life under the Taliban. So I was asked to join a mission of a couple of US women's groups who are supporting Afghan women either inside the country or to leave the country. And so we were there to just do an assessment of how things were going with regard to the work that they were undertaking. I won't say much more about the specifics, other than it was a very moving experience to be able to talk with women and men, ordinary women and men who are, trying to survive after the Taliban takeover, and to hear their stories.
I think the whole time you were there was just one case where you were stopped by the Taliban.
Yes, we were on our way to a meeting with an NGO who, again, we always made sure is it safe for us to come to your office, or would you like us to meet somewhere else? We can provide a more private setting. And they were absolutely no, please come to our office. So we were driving to meet with this NGO, and we were stopped at a checkpoint. The male driver was asked to step out of the car. And he was basically read the riot act, because even though we were properly dressed with hijabs, veils, and covered completely, our faces weren't covered. And it had been a policy that had been brought in a few weeks earlier that females needed to have their faces covered. They could still have their eyes covered or showing, but not their faces. So our driver said, well, they all have breathing problems. This is why they can't cover their faces. And basically the Taliban said, you get your women under control, or you will be sent to jail or fined. So it's not the fact that the women are breaking the law doesn't in some ways matter to them. It's the male of the household or whatever that will suffer the consequences. So we wore masks after that, which most women who aren't wearing burqas, that's how they get around the ruling to make sure their faces are covered, or to wear masks. So I was joking with some women protesters that it's so good to know that the Taliban are really concerned about women's health,
Right.
wanting them to cover up.
I see. Let's turn to Canada for a moment, because the Canadian government, as I mentioned earlier, has the Taliban listed as a terrorist organization. We won't recognize them. We've given some money through various organizations to help, but not a lot. We've committed to taking in 40,000 Afghans as well. And while we sort of stand off and look from the outside in, life goes on in Afghanistan. There are 14 embassies that are operating, although those particular countries don't recognize the Taliban government officially, but there are 14 embassies that are there. There are 70 that are accredited to the government in Kabul today, mostly based in Pakistan. The UAE is running the airport. And I wonder, given everything, and I know this is a very difficult question because of our past role in the country, I'm wondering if the Canadian government, in your view, is being short-sighted. Is it time we said that, and our allies as well, that we need to do more, and not only bringing people here, but also in our engagement with the Taliban. We may not need to recognize them at this point, but other countries are in there, and they are helping, and we seem to be averse to doing so.
Yes, it's an excellent question that we could probably discuss for the next 2 hours. It has many layers and subtleties, the answer. So first of all, there's always something that we could be doing more. 40,000, bringing in 40,000 is a drop in the bucket. Comparatively speaking, compared to the expenditure of time and resources that we put into helping this country develop for 20 years, 40,000 is almost meaningless. Second of all, you mentioned it at the beginning, there is a humanitarian crisis that is going on an unprecedented scale. That's what the UN is calling it, an unprecedented scale, where basically 90% of the population is living, under, the poverty line. Over 60% of the population is living with food scarcity, and that's growing worse by day. Malnutrition in children under 5 is %. I mean, it's unprecedented. So we absolutely need to be doing more. But our current anti-terrorism laws do not allow us to engage on a humanitarian level, because the Taliban, rightly so, are have been listed as a terrorist organization in Canada since 2013, I think, and our anti-terrorism laws prevents any resources or money going directly to terrorist organizations. So that means Canada cannot support humanitarian efforts there, except through multilateral organizations like the United Nations. But Canadian NGOs have been asking the government to revise their laws or figure out workarounds, the anti-terrorism laws, for the past almost year now, and the government has steadfastly refused. Canada is the only major Western government that hasn't already done this, to allow an exemption to work in Canada. And so far, we've gotten no answers from the government as to why they refuse to do this. They're just claiming that the Taliban is a terrorist organization, and that is it. With regard to recognition, Afghans will tell you they do not want the Taliban recognized. They want engagement in the country. They think the sanctions are wrong because it only impacts ordinary Afghans. So they would like to see a lifting of the sanctions. They would like to see, terrorism laws revised, but no recognition, because what they say is that gives license to the Taliban to say, yes, it's acceptable what you are doing in this country, when for them it is absolutely not.
It seems to me, in this whole conversation, the women and girls are the ones being held hostage. On the one side, the Taliban will say, if you don't give us assistance, well, we're not in a position to let girls go to school. It's not safe, or the parents don't want them to go. And there's a million reasons. And then in the West, we say, well, we won't give you assistance unless you let girls go to school. So you're in a catch-22. But sometimes I think from the Western perspective, that it's actually a convenient excuse for us not to actually get involved. So we won't give you help unless you get women, let girls go to school, and women have jobs and all of this, knowing full well the Taliban won't agree. They won't agree to that. And so we can sort of say, well, we can't help. I'm really sorry there. Do you get that sense? Are women and girls being used as a simple bargaining chip? Does somebody need to look past this and say, okay?
Absolutely. First of all, it's very clear that what is happening in Afghanistan is gender apartheid. There can be no other term that can be applied to it. And we've already seen, when there are attempts inside the country for women and girls to speak out. There were protests about a year ago. Women bravely stood on the streets demanding their rights. And over the months, the Taliban more and more repressed those protests, so much so that the leaders were arrested. They were beating women who showed up in public to protest. And so that, in effect, they had to take their protests inside. They are very clear on the school ban. There was a recent example where in Paktia province, which is in the southeast, a couple of weeks ago, local elders themselves decided that they felt that girls' schools should open. So they allowed the schools to open, and the Taliban brutally shut down the schools. So it is clear that this is their position and they're not going to change. But I agree with you that the international community, it is like a convenient thing. Allow girls education and we'll give you this or that, and we'll bring in humanitarian assistance. But uh, I think that I think there's fatigue from the international community.
Mm,
I think after 20 years, when Kabul fell, it was like, okay, I think we're basically done here.
mm,
It has not remained on their minds. It The tragedy of Ukraine, in a way, was a convenience for the international community, because then they could say, "Oh, Afghanistan disappeared from the headlines and Ukraine took its place." And that is not to say what's happening in Ukraine is not as bad as what's happening in Afghanistan by any stretch of the imagination. But
mm.
the international community, like the rest of us, the media, we ourselves, we have very
Yeah.
our attention spans are very short lived, and so
Well,
uh,
when
yeah.
so you're right. I mean, you're right. And when you say the international community, though, I sometimes think that's actually us. I mean, that really is the United States and Canada and Great Britain and a few of the other allies, because the rest of the international community, I noticed in June, India reopened its embassy in Kabul with a small staff. And if you read the Indian newspapers are quite proud of the assistance that they have been providing, whether it's in foodstuffs and other support. So other members of the international community are engaging, and they're just simply not hung up on the issue of women's and girls' education. They will obviously raise it, and I'm sure there is concern there, but they're not letting that stop them being engaged. Now, obviously I think for their own strategic purposes, right? I mean, let's not, obviously, if you look at the embassies that are open in Kabul, they're all from they're all Afghanistan's neighbors for the most part. And so they have their own reasons for being there. A couple of things also came to mind while we were speaking. You're absolutely right. The Taliban mimicking the United States military in the way they dress. It's sometimes hard, if you look at a picture of a Taliban member, to determine whether they are a Taliban member or a member of the former Afghan National Army, or a member of the United States Marines or something or other. So that I always thought that was quite interesting to see. And I know the Canadian government does get a lot of flack, but I checked earlier on, we've brought in almost 20,000 Afghans of the 40,000. Many are lingering inside Afghanistan without any way out, as we know, but we're about halfway there. But then again, it's been over a year. So there's obviously more that can be done. And then you mentioned Afghanistan dropping off the radar. And this is something we spoke about also earlier on, a few days ago or yesterday, I think. I was in Latvia about 3 weeks ago visiting our troops who were deployed as part of the NATO battle group. And the task force commander said to me, our young soldiers, they'll say to us, would you guys stop speaking about Afghanistan? Because when we left the combat mission in 2011, the young soldiers of today, they were 10, 11, 12 years old. And for them, time has moved on, and now they're facing the Russians, and we're back to corps and divisions and brigades, the Cold War in many respects. And Afghanistan is very much like yesterday for them. And I think that speaks to the wider issue of Afghanistan dropping off the radar.
Yes, I remember when you said that yesterday. That really struck me, and I do understand why 20-something-year-olds would feel, why does Afghanistan matter? They were so young when 9/11 happened, And and the world has definitely moved on. Like, why this one little country? So that really resonated with me. And so I just thought, okay, why should it matter? And I think, first of all, why we should be concerned about Afghanistan is, number one, this huge unfolding humanitarian crisis. It's for human beings, the suffering on the massive scale that is going on in the country. We should care. And there's so many issues to unpack around responding to the humanitarian crisis that we talked about, our anti-terrorism laws, the Taliban and what to do about them. So there are all those issues to address. But also for international peace and security reasons that we need to be concerned about Afghanistan. It's a hotbed for other extremists, as we've seen from the recent drone killing of one of Al-Qaeda's leaders in downtown Kabul. What was it, about a month ago or so?
Yeah, July.
July, a couple of
Al-Zawahiri, yeah.
Yes. And the Taliban claim, oh, we didn't even know he was in the country. Well, we all know that is absolutely a joke. They know exactly who is in the country and where they are. So the Taliban are providing open doors for other extremist groups. And then there are, as you mentioned at the beginning, huge flows of refugees, particularly to the surrounding countries. Many of these countries are already unstable. Case in point, Pakistan, which has just is in absolute political turmoil, and yet they have the most number of Afghan refugees by far. And that is only adding to the instability, the political instability in these countries. Tajikistan has just started deporting Afghan refugees, even if there are many Afghan refugees with like pathways to Canada, but they're just waiting for the final documentation, and they are even being deported back to Afghanistan. So there's a lot of regional instability that could easily, anything could sort of spark those embers that are already in place. But for me, I think the most important reason why we should care is the fact that, half of the citizens of a country are being denied their very basic rights. And I think this sets an incredibly dangerous precedent. Women tell me, yes, it's slightly more secure in Afghanistan, if you don't mind the occasional bombing at the Russian embassy, or, mosques being bombed or whatever. It's more safe for them to step onto the streets, but they can't go to school. They can't go to work. They can't go outside to hang out with their friends, go shopping, or even go to a doctor without having a male relative to escort them. So some of them have told me, I'd rather be I'm better off dead. I mean, this is no life for myself. Right. So I think for all these reasons, this is why we need to care about Afghanistan.
Yeah, and I would agree with you as well. And for the audience, if you do have any questions for Corey, there is the Q&A section. So please go ahead if you have any questions. And I think just coming back though to the whole reason why we should do more in Afghanistan for altruistic purposes, of course, yes, what we see happening with women and girls in particular, and the failing economy and all of that. But of course, we have our own interests as well, right? I mean, we've touched on it. if Afghanistan fails, as we've seen before, it creates a space for terrorist organizations to take root. Even now, the Taliban are dealing with the Islamic State in their own country. We see the bombings of Shia mosques, and as you mentioned, the Russian embassy, where 2 of their staff and I think 6 or 7 Afghanis were also killed in that explosion. The refugee issue. My Turkish friends will tell me that they're home to many Afghan refugees, and they see Afghan refugees leaving the country through Iran. Iran has a lot as well, and then they make their way to Turkey and onwards to Europe. Minorities, all of the minorities that feel that they have no place in the country as well. So for all of these reasons, it does make you wonder why governments, notwithstanding Ukraine and all the other things that happen on a daily basis, why we just sort of tend to want to sit on the sidelines. And it must be incredibly frustrating for you and the NGOs that are sort of waiting in the wings to do something.
Yes, it is. As always, there's a lot of talk, but very little action that we are seeing. I do think it's battle fatigue in a way, and I understand that. To watch the investment that you make in a country over 20 years and just to see it disappear up in smoke. But a lot of that is on us and how we did not get things right in Afghanistan. We did not listen to the Afghans. We prioritized our own security over development. We, supported warlords. The list goes on.
Right.
All the, we didn't crack down enough on endemic corruption going on in the country. I mean, there's a whole list of things that we did not do. But so I think there's absolutely no appetite to go back into the country, either, now not under the Taliban in terms of, development, but also militarily. I think the West will not go in militarily, and I'm not necessarily a fan of this is the way that we need to answer Afghanistan. I think we need to answer the issues with Afghanistan as figuring out how, as much as there are hundreds of thousands of Afghans who are in dire need of support, who are at risk in their country. But how do we make a country for Afghanistan that is, or work with Afghans to make a country that is developed and safe enough for them to live in their own country? And the answer needs to come from Afghans. It can never be imposed from the outside.
No, and to even go further back, when we think about Afghanistan and that period of Soviet occupation with the Mujahideen, which we in the West, in the United States in particular, supported, and we really didn't care about the Afghan people. We were only interested in draining and bleeding dry the Soviet presence there. 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed in that period. Many more were wounded. I can't even begin to think about the number of Afghans that were killed. And of course, even then, the Soviets, they were also engaging in development work. They were building roads and hospitals and schools and so on. And we were happily allowing the Mujahideen to go around blowing them up. So I've always thought we've had a long-standing moral responsibility to try to put that country back together. And we did try, but as you say, we made a huge mess of it in the end. And it ties into a question. Amar has a question: what would it take for Western nations to intervene? Again, well, as you said, we've we've run out of energy in that respect. But what I hear from the Northern Alliance, just looking at the news, they say no one's helping them at all. Like there's no one government that's willing to turn to the Northern Alliance or any remains of an opposition that are left to say, let's have another try at removing the government. So so when we say intervene, what can we do?
That's an excellent question. I'd like to address the Northern Alliance for a moment, because that does come up in conversation. But we have to understand, first of all, and this is part of the riddle and complexity of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is knitted together out of a variety of tribes and ethnicities and different religious minorities, Shia Muslims, Hazaras, who are a very persecuted ethnicity, and they happen to be Shia Muslim as well. And the Northern Alliance are attempting to bravely do battle against the Taliban when there is no other group that has been able to come together and militarily to try and fight against the Taliban. But they also represent one group. Afghanistan is a complexity, partly because of there are so many different groups there. And the son of the Ahmed Shah Massoud, who led the Northern Alliance 20 years ago and who was assassinated 2 days before September 11th, he himself was a very controversial figure, and he speaks to the adage of one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. And so a lot of Afghans don't have the same, even if they don't support the Taliban, they don't see the Northern Alliance necessarily as the liberators that other Afghans may see them as.
And I know Leonard here asked about battle fatigue being an absence of political leadership. I think we've seen the Canadian government is not the most forward-leaning governments that we see. We always seem to be a little late to the situation. If I could answer that, Leonard, in that way, maybe Corey will comment on it in part of some of the other questions coming up, because Jim's asking us about how you see Pakistan in all of this in the post-war Afghanistan. You were in Pakistan besides Afghanistan. What are your thoughts on the role of Pakistan moving forward?
Pakistan has always had a huge role to play in Afghanistan. After all, the Taliban, although it's Afghan, but it did spring from Afghan refugees in Pakistan, which was encouraged and nurtured by the Pakistan secret police, who hold a lot of sway in the country. They are probably the most powerful entity in Pakistan. They have been interfering in Afghan politics for a very long time. They will continue to do so. So they have a huge role. This is where the West in particular, the international community, can actually have a role to play in getting Pakistan to stop meddling in the affairs of Afghanistan. The international community hasn't shown any appetite for taking that on to date, and I don't think they will. So Pakistan is going to continue to have a free reign in meddling in Afghanistan.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the biggest complaints out of Kabul by the Taliban right now is that Pakistan is allowing the United States to use Pakistani military bases to fly drones from over Afghanistan. So you were there, I was there. It's a funny world at times, isn't it? And I have one more question as we're getting near the end of our talk with you, and it's from Diane, and Diane is asking about the various NGOs that we know operate in Canada and US. You've been working with them and Lara. We have Canadian Women for Afghan Women, and do you have any sense of how many organizations, like in Canada, for example, are actively working in Afghanistan or supporting Afghanistan? Somehow we hear about education being provided to girls through the internet and so on. Do you have a sense of how big that community is in Canada, for example?
It's quite small. Actually, there's a lot of organizations here that are working on the resettlement of those Afghans who are coming to Canada, and trying to support their efforts to successfully have them resettled in Afghanistan. But working on the ground in Afghanistan, whether it's from afar or virtually or in the country, there are not a lot of organizations, in part just because of the challenges that you and I, or not in part, wholly because of the challenges that you and I have spoken about. There are some small scale initiatives, but they are not enough, and they need to be scaled up more. And if the government is really interested in Afghanistan, as they say they are, it's these kinds of small scale efforts that they should be putting funding into, like virtual schools for girls, or you know, small scale income generating projects for women that they can do again online. A virtual world is better than, Afghan women will tell me, engaging in a virtual world is absolutely better than just, being stuck at home with absolutely nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's a small step, but an important one. And I do see that we have 2 minutes left to go, so I'm going to have to bring this session to a close. It's always terrific to have opportunities to speak with you, Corey, and we'll have more in the future. And while we think about Afghanistan dropping off the radar from time to time, here we are. We're speaking about Afghanistan next week. Next Wednesday, we have Lotfullah Najifazada here in Victoria. He was the former director of Tolo News in Afghanistan, the top news channel. He's going to be speaking at one of our activities, a lunch for the CIC Victoria folks, and we'll also have him out at the University of Victoria speaking to the folks out there. It's amazing how many Afghans are in our communities now. We often don't realize it. And we want to, particularly this month, it's roughly a year after after Kabul fell, to sort of speak about these issues and raise them up once more. And we know we're not the only ones who do that, but it's one small step, I suppose, that you've contributed to this morning, and everybody that's been listening here also. And we will get this recording around to those that couldn't attend this morning. We'll have it available on our CIC YouTube channel as well. So Corey, thank you so much. Any last words before we say goodbye to you today?
Thanks. First of all, thank you so much, Chris, for the opportunity. Always a pleasure to chat with you. And I think the only thing that I would like to say is, please don't forget Afghanistan. I'm a big believer in writing your NPs, asking them to hold their commitments, hold to their commitments, to increase their commitments, reform the anti-terrorism law, Article 83.03 of our criminal code, and just to stand by the Afghan people in whatever way. Join a sponsorship group, become a sponsor for Afghans. You can privately sponsor Afghans to come to Canada. Pretty much this is the only way that Afghans now are going to be able to access coming to Canada, and donate to organizations that are working with Afghans or in Afghanistan.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Corey. We shall see you probably next week or so, and we'll keep on this issue for sure. And thank you, audience, the audience, for being here today. Have a great rest of the day, and we will see you again at some of our future events. All right, take care, Corey.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.